Okay, it's all about faithful witness then. Now, they're the good points. So they've stood up against persecution, and they didn't lose heart even when Antipas lost his life in the city where Satan lives. You see, imperial persecution, where Satan has so much power and authority. Antipas was faithful. But I have a few things against you. So here's the negative. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. Now, who can tell me about Balaam and Balak from those passages in the book of Numbers? Did anybody do that research and background? And very briefly, can somebody put into your own words what happened in the days of Balak and Balaam? Who were these guys?
Curse the Israelites.
Yes.
And put them on a stumbling block for it, you know. Put them on a stumbling block for it, for the Israelites.
Yep.
But that didn't happen.
Yes. Very good. So who was Balak? He was king of Moab. Very good. The good old Moabites. He was the king of Moab, and he didn't like the Israelites. So he wanted to get an advantage over the Israelites, and so he hired a fellow called Balaam to come and make a curse over the Israelites, so he could get the upper hand, you see. And Balaam was riding along on his ass, you remember that?
Yes.
And the ass spoke. Oh, it's a great story. Out of the mouths of asses comes the truth. And Balaam gets to see that he's up against powers that he cannot overcome. And so 3 times he tries to make this curse over the Israelites because Balak wants it. And 3 times he fails and he ends up blessing them. So he can't pronounce a curse on the Israelites. And Balak's sitting there grinding his teeth saying, you know, why don't you get at it? And Balaam just can't do it. And so the Israelites end up getting blessed. So that's what we read of in Numbers 21-25. But there's a little after account of this story, and that's from chapter 31, verse 16. What does Balaam actually cunningly suggest to Balak, even though he can't curse the Israelites?
Money.
Money, yes. What else?
To get friendly with the women.
Yeah, get friendly with the Israelite women, you guys. You know, go in there and entice them into sexual immorality. Because if you want to bring this nation down, if you want to overcome them in terms of their God and their power and their strength and so on, then get them from the inside. So if you can entice them with sins against the 7th commandment, Yahweh's 7th commandment, if you can encourage them in that, then they will be judged by their own God, in effect. This was the clever, cunning plan that he came up with. So he couldn't curse them, but he did come up with a way to bring them down. And so that's why the text picks up on this, and it says, you know, here was Balaam who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. So throw your religion away for the sake of these good-looking women. That's basically it. And it was a clever plan, and it did bring about a judgment of God. So why would Jesus say to this congregation at Pergamum that he has this against them, that they have some who hold to, quote-unquote, the teaching of Balaam? What's the problem then in the congregation?
Idol worship and sexual immorality.
Yes, that's the implication, isn't it? That they're involved in idol worship and sexual immorality. They're turning away from the standards of God. And it's interesting, because here you've got, when there's open opposition, you know, through the imperial cult, they stand firm. And the Romans can't come along and make them say, Caesar is Lord. Guys like Antipas will stand up and say, no, you know, and we're prepared to lose our lives for that. So when there's a full frontal onslaught of the enemy, then they will stand firm and not resist. But how about this cunning attack of the enemy? How about a Balaam-like attack? You can engage in a bit of sexual immorality, a bit of idolatry on the side. And it's okay. And maybe there are some ways in which you can advance in that, because a lot of these religions, like Dionysus and so on, they had sexual immorality associated with their religions in order to get ahead. And so they were subject to that kind of cunning attack, just like Balaam did of old. And that was the problem. They were compromising at that point. And also he says that there are some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. And again, that's come up earlier. And we don't know a lot about the Nicolaitans, but it seems like it was some sort of teaching along the lines of this Balaam background in the Old Testament. So some form of idolatry, sexual immorality, Christians being enticed. Okay, questions or comments on that? Is that clear? Is that straightforward for you? And you can see that Jesus, once again, is bringing back an incident that occurred in Israel's past. We saw there are parallels with Daniel, and now we're seeing that Jesus takes this incident of the past and he reapplies it and says, this is history repeating itself because you guys are falling into exactly the same trap as the Israelites. So Israel stood firm against the full frontal attack of the Moabites. No problem there. But this subtle attack of compromise, And in what ways might we be tempted to do exactly the same thing today? In what ways might we compromise by accepting the views of the world, say?
Be unequally yoked together with unbelievers.
Unequally yoked together with unbelievers? I mean, that's a concept that particularly applies to marriage. But if we're going to go out as believers and marry an unbeliever, I mean, that's going to be a problem. Sort of thing that Balaam encouraged. Whether or not there's sexual immorality there or not, marriage is going to cause a problem. And it may well be that the next generation of children are not going to be faithful to the covenant because there is this problem within the marriage right there from the outset. But there are other ways too, such as society's view about homosexuality now. If you think about the changing perception of homosexuality, even in a generation. When I was you guys' age, growing up teenager, homosexuality within society was frowned upon very strongly. So in the 80s, when there was the homosexual law reform bill going on, and they wanted to legalise homosexuality, 800,000 people signed a petition. It's the biggest petition in the history of New Zealand Parliament. 800,000 people signed this petition to leave the law exactly where it is. Government says we can do what we want, and so they do. And now within a generation since then, there are changing perceptions of homosexuality. And it's a lot more socially acceptable now than it was then. And so you find churches that are sort of picking up on this and saying, oh, well, if we say that homosexuality is abhorrent in the sight of God, if we say it's really bad, then we get it in the neck from society. So they're rethinking the Bible's teaching about homosexuality and accepting what society is telling them. And they're making ways for this to be acceptable not only within churches but also in church leadership. Now I think that's a classic example of how Balaam can get his way with Christians by enticing them to embrace the thinking and lifestyle of the world instead of standing firm against it. And it's a very subtle attack, you see. It's not like the full frontal onslaught. We're rounding up the Christians and we're putting them in jail. But this attack is much more subtle. Okay, something to think about. You may... Yes, Willie?
What about the feminist movement?
Feminist movement, another example. Feminism, huge influence within New Zealand society and Western society overall. And so in the church too, there's a desire to relook at the whole matter of women in church leadership. And a number of conservative churches around the world are doing this now. And it usually starts with women deacons first, and then it goes to women elders and pastors.